Excellent. All right. So welcome to the third installment, hopefully not the last, of the information about requirements development and management for, I call it business data analytics, but we're really going to just talk about requirements generically. And I always point out to people that if you're struggling with requirements, you're not alone. Look at all the different standards that have been created just to help us with this challenge of requirements. As a matter of fact, that's the whole reason our whole industry exists. Our business analyst industry exists is because requirements are hard. So I always try to point out to people that if you're struggling or your organization is struggling with requirements, you're not alone. Everybody struggles with requirements. That's why we exist. That's the whole purpose. If requirements were easy, there'd be no reason to have business analysts. So it's not a bad thing. It's just the reality of it all. Anyway, so what we want to do today is this is a class that I've put together specifically for requirements. It's a traditional requirements class, but I kind of geared it more towards business business data, because data seems to be something that more and more of us are having to grapple with as business analysts. Just kind of a quick, and later on, if you have any interest in learning more about the class, please feel free to reach out to me. All these topics that I've been covering are under what I call the foundation section of the course. The elicit, analyze, document, and validate, that's just traditional requirements development and management for really anything, whether it's product, process, and or data. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Richard Frederick. I owned a software company in the 1990s. As a matter of fact, they turned 24 yesterday, the software part of the business. And the reason I know that is because we started the software part of the business on my daughter's birthday, and that was yesterday, and she turned 24 yesterday. So I always remember it because every time her birthday rolls around, I'm like, oh, I got another anniversary. But in this particular section, what I really wanted to do was address requirements and testing. And if you were in either of the earlier sessions, you probably remember that my whole mission is to try to get a business analyst to think like a tester. I'm not saying you have to become a tester. I'm not saying that I'm an expert on testing. What I'm trying to tell you is that from my experience of going out and meeting thousands of students and lots and lots and lots of organizations and lots of industries across the board, what I found was the more the analyst could think like a tester, the easier it is to elicit, analyze, document, or communicate and validate requirements. So we want to just kind of talk about what does it mean to think like a tester, all right? And so we'll start off with, well, what's a requirement? And there are a lot of definitions of requirements, and by the way, they're all correct. When I'm talking to people, people will ask me, well, what's the right definition? And I'm like, I have no idea. The concept of right and wrong isn't really, in my opinion, the way to look at it. The way to look at it is, does it work or doesn't it work? And what works in some organizations does not work in other organizations. So you can't really say that there's one tried and true way that works across every place that you go. However, that being said, what I've found is, let's think of it as a trick as an analyst. The more you understand that whatever it is that you elicit from your stakeholder is ultimately going to be tested, and that test is going to determine whether the requirement worked or didn't, the better it's going to be for you when you go out to elicit. So an analyst that really understands testing, it makes their job easier when they're eliciting from their stakeholders. And why is that important? Well, basically because stakeholders communicate with something I call nuanced ambiguity. And this talking to them. In their mind, they know what they want, but what they present or speak isn't exactly what it is that, can be tested. And we'll have an example of that here in a moment. So understanding a requirement as a testable statement will really begin to help you figure out what part you're not hearing from them. When you're eliciting information from them, you'll start to figure out, oh yeah, this is what's missing. So what do I mean by a testable statement? A test case. In particular, a test case has really two parts. It's got a main clause, which I call the front side, and it's got a subordinate clause, which is a backside. And for most of us as analysts, all we really deal with most of the time is the subordinate clause or the backside, the then statement. And as we go through kind of this quick idea about testing, I sort of had to color code things just because it's easier for me. Because I'm just not that smart. There's just too much going on. So, but I wanted to talk about, well, what do we mean by a requirement as a testable statement? Okay, so here's an example of a subordinate clause. It's not a complete testable statement. It's just the idea that part of it has information that you can go research and figure out, hey, is this going to work or not? So it's not uncommon. As a matter of fact, it's very common to talk to a stakeholder and get their requirement, which again is correct, as something like, hey, we need our customers to know that we care about them. That's our requirement. And in their mind, that's absolutely correct, and it is correct. But for us as analysts, that's not enough information to go build something on. So we have to take that, and by the way, that section, I call that the request, the capability. So generally speaking, when you're talking to your stakeholders, most of the time, all they're giving you is a capability. I mean, it's the exceptional stakeholder that really fully understands what they're asking for or how to explain what they want in the level of detail that's needed or necessary for you to go build it. So most executives or stakeholders that are really busy, they're just going to give you the capability, AKA the request. Our job as an analyst is to figure out how you turn that into something that can be measured. So I call that as measured by, or the constraint. So for example, the request would be, hey, we need our customers to know that we care about them, as measured by 95% of customer inquiries must be successfully resolved in the first contact by the end of Q4 of this year. Now you have kind of a complete partial statement. You have a complete need, a then statement, but you really don't have a full testable case yet. You just have part of it. But the point that I want you to take away from this is just to remember, you cannot test a request. So the request in and of itself, we need our customers to know that we care about them. That's not testable at all. You're getting closer by adding some level of measurement. You're getting the pieces there closer and closer. Okay, now going back to 25 years ago when I got into this business of software, the standard way you wrote a requirement was something called a TSS. Many of you probably are familiar with this, the system shall, or the system shall allow the user to. What they didn't tell you was that you could use a then statement, that it's the subordinate clause. Then the system shall, or then the system shall allow the user to. And most people don't write it like that. They just write it as the system shall, or the system shall allow the user to. So again, traditionally, we don't think in terms when we're writing requirements in a test case. We just think of writing a requirement as the way that we're always supposed to write requirements. So as an example, looking back at what we just had, you really had kind of two types. You had then the system shall capability, functional capability as measured by a constraint, or you might have then the system shall have a functional capability operating within a non-functional condition as measured by a constraint. So again, just adding the then is thinking like a tester. That's all I'm trying to get you to, is I'm trying to move you slowly to get to think like a tester. Today, we use more of and by the way, this is kind of more of what I call how it's built, sort of a product orientation approach to writing requirements. Today, we have user stories, which I think of more as a process orientation. It doesn't have to be, but it's a little bit softer and friendlier, I think. It doesn't sound so cold, the system shall. And the user story kind of approach, as a actor, job title, stakeholder, I need a capability so that I can benefit. That's pretty much all that's in a user story until you want to test it, and then you have to add as measured by some kind of constraint. That term is called acceptance criteria. So what I've been kind of describing as measured by, the constraint, is also referred to as acceptance criteria. So when you're writing business requirements as user stories as measured by constraint, AKA acceptance criteria, then you can get in and get even more detail again. Given a precondition or an input, when the trigger or the process or the event occurs, then some kind of planned output or result happens. Okay. And then what you're doing is you're just testing what actually happened. And if there's no variance, then your test passes and the requirement works. So again, I stay away from, is it right or is it wrong? I just try to point out that, hey, does it work or does it not work? Let me give you an example. And this is something that I'm always trying to make available to people to understand, that a requirement for one person can be multiple requirements for someone else. So you're the analyst, you went out, you put together a user story, transfer money between accounts. As a bank customer, I need to transfer money between my accounts so that I have money where it needs to be, or where I need it to be, excuse me. And for a lot of analysts, that's the requirement. That's all there is. And there's only the one requirement. That's all that is. But I always try to expose this and let people know that, well, no, there's probably a lot of requirements tied to this user story, which again can be a requirement. For example, once I add acceptance criteria, then I might set up scenarios. And one scenario might be, well, here's sufficient funds. And another scenario might be, well, what does this look like if there are insufficient funds? So again, given precondition or input, account A has 125 available and account B has 375 available. When I transfer $200 from B to A, then I should see a confirmation message, and A should now have 325 and B should have 175. So when I go to test it, I should see a confirmation message. And if I do, it passes. Great. A second scenario might be that there's insufficient funds. Given account A has 125, account B has 375. When I transfer 200 from A to B, the reverse, then I should see an error message, and A should still have the 125 and B should still have the 375. But let's say I go to test it and I see a confirmation message. That's a failure. That means that requirement didn't work. The point that I'm always trying to make is, and particularly when you're dealing with business rules, this is not a business rule, but just understanding this, is that you might have multiple conditions with multiple variables tied to one user story. And so some people will go, well, you know, there's one requirement, there's one user story. And I'm like, well, no, there might be dozens of test cases. And all of those test cases have to pass in order for that user story to pass, which technically means if you have 12 test cases, you now have 12 requirements. And it's great to see everybody's eyes just sort of get really big as it sort of dawns on them that, oh my goodness, yeah, they all have to pass in order for this one user story to pass. So the more you can start to think like a tester, the more to help you really begin to understand how to make your systems work. Because a lot of times as an analyst, we sort of elicit requirements, which is our job, and turn them over to another group. And then the other group takes it and then they go off and they build something, or they implement a process or build a product or whatever it might be. And for some reason, it doesn't come back and work effectively. And we kind of don't really understand why. And so there's a lot of miscommunication, nuanced ambiguity going back and forth. And then we got to go back to the stakeholder, and there's some miscommunication, nuanced ambiguity. And no one ever told the analyst, oh yeah, there's all these tests. And by the way, those are all requirements. And the way the story was written, or the acceptance criteria was written, caused something to fail down the line. And if we had kind of rewritten it a different way, it probably would have eliminated that. But since no one ever told the analyst how to write it to begin with, or how to think about it to begin with, then we have this analyst who's become a bottleneck by no fault of their own, just simply by the fact that no one ever explained this to them. So that was kind of just, so what does it mean to think like a tester? Okay, well, in the traditional sense of requirements and testing, there's something known as a V model, which I suspect many of you are familiar with. If you've been in this business anytime, you've probably seen this or heard this. And this is what we teach traditionally in the literature, is the V model. And it starts kind of at the top on the left side, where it shows you business requirements, and then you go to your systems requirements, and then you get to your architectural kind of requirements, and then you get down to unit design, and then coding. And then you have what's called unit integration testing, quality of service testing, system testing, and acceptance testing. But it doesn't always work that way. And that was the thing that, because this looks like a very, hey, just follow these steps down and follow them back up, and it all works flawlessly. No. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way. And I wish it were binary, ones and zeros, very clear cut. But a lot of things in technology are not clear cut. That's kind of the irony of it. That's part of the reason why requirements are so hard, is there's so many points in the process that can undermine the whole process. So what I decided to do was kind of show analysts another way to look at it. And again, these aren't mutually exclusive, because you'll see that I've connected them back on the previous thing. But what I wanted to kind of introduce was the 4 quadrants of testing. That's really kind of where I'm going with this. At the top, you have what I call the business-facing tests, where you're either have a person facing with a machine, or you might have just people communicating with each other. At the lower level, you have what I call technology facing. So you'll see it says nuance and syntax. And really what we're trying to do as analysts is, we analysts are trying to convert nuance into syntax. If you weren't in the earliest class when I was talking about how hard it is to train a robot, and I talked about how the nuance of, hey, can you get me a glass of water? Or can you get me some water? I need water. You could say that to a human, and that's all you need to tell them. And they could figure out on their own how to go get you water, bring it back. They'd find a container, they'd find a source, they'd put it together, they'd bring it back. You don't have to tell them, I need it in a glass, I need it cold, you just say, I need water, and they're gonna go figure that out. To teach a robot to do that, you have to convert nuance into syntax. And that's where things kind of have a struggle. That's where they sort of fall apart. So when we test, we sort of test this idea of nuance to syntax. And on one side, you'll see it's how it's built, product orientation, the system shall. And on the other side, how it's used, process orientation, which I call user stories, as a I need so that. And we kind of try to pull all these pieces together. Again, while it seems like these are these nice quadrants, not everything fits perfectly in the boxes, but it's a framework to think about. And that's really all I'm trying to get you to, as we go through all of these little ideas, these little lunch and learns. I'm just trying to give you a different way to look at stuff. That's all it is. And hopefully you'll be able to walk away when you go back to your office and just look at things slightly different than maybe you were before you came online. So what are some of these tests that are in these quadrants? Well, and generally once we start at the top level and we sort of decompose all of the requirements down, you know, the business requirements, the system requirements or business to stakeholder, to system, functional, non-functional, and then that gets turned over, and then those get turned into test cases. Those test cases are kind of structured into, like I said, these quadrants. For example, at the lowest level, you've got in the lower right-hand corner, and I'll just start there, Q1, unit integration testing. So once code is developed, and again, I'm always talking about test-driven development. You might have unit testing at the lowest level, and then component testing, and then an integration of the different components. And a lot of that today is automated. As a matter of fact, a huge portion of Q1 is automated testing, because you can do it. Q2 is the next layer up, where you're laying on a user interface and you're trying to make sure that the interface works as designed or as needed. And so you start off kind of with a user interface navigation test, where you're just kind of walking through the navigation systems. You know, you're either moving horizontally across, let's say, a ribbon, or maybe you're moving down a menu structure. And each of the screens might have functionality, a checkbox, a drop down, a radio button, etc. So there's that part of the testing. And then you get into, you know, actual functional. If I put data in, valid data, does it work? And for a lot of us as analysts, that we think that that's testing, which it is, but it's not complete testing. What a lot of your testers actually do is they do what's called negative testing. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, that's when you're trying to break the system. So I always call testing breaking. You're really trying to break the system. And so they'll have invalid data tests, they'll have boundary tests, they'll have condition coverage tests for business rules, or they build all these matrices to try to figure out condition to the variance to the power condition. And then you have prototypes and simulation. All right. User acceptance testing is really pretty much manual, and it can interface with the machine, or it can be person to person. It can be procedural, where you're never touching the machine at all. It might be the testing that you do when you're checking a process, just to make sure that, hey, does this process work right before we ever hit the machine? It might also touch the machine. So again, between these two, Q3 and Q2, there's a lot of overlap. So, but you might have acceptance test driven development, specification by example, behavior driven design, design-based testing. You might have activity coverage, decision coverage, design condition coverage, exploratory testing, where you use all kinds of different things. And then Q4 really is your non-functional. That's your quality of service testing, things like performance benchmarks, security benchmarks, stress testing, load testing. There's lots of tests. I mean, I'm barely scratching the surface, of all the different kinds of testing that can be done. But I'm showing you this, and the reason I'm telling you this is it helps sometimes to think in terms of when you're hearing a need, quote, requirement, request from your stakeholder, it helps to think in terms of what quadrant does that fit in. So when someone's talking to me, I can think, oh, that's a unit test. Or in my head, I'll go, oh, that's a Q2 system test. Or, oh, that's a acceptance test type of requirement. Or that's a quality of service test kind of requirement. And when I know what type of test it is, it helps me write the statement better, knowing that, the closer I can get it to what it's ultimately going to be when it's tested, the less rework in the process. So that's really what this whole little section was about, was just kind of getting there. We talk about test automation. And again, the more repetitions that we do, the more the machine learns from us. Somebody asked me, do you think all testing will be done by robots someday? And I said, I don't think so, because a lot of it doesn't ever touch a machine per se. However, that's not to say that you can't have cameras that are tied to intelligence that can monitor what people are doing and look at pattern recognition and give you feedback. So again, this is all kind of stuff that's happening. So, and then kind of lastly, there is nice to know a universal testing method. It just kind of runs through this process of model your test space, determine your coverage, meaning, define what the system's going to be tested, decide what needs to be tested, where's the data going to come from, determine your oracles, the sources of truth, determine your procedures, configure the system, operate the test system, observe the results, evaluate the results, and then report the results. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'll open the floor to questions if there are any questions. So again, the whole premise was think like a tester will help you elicit requirements better. Use the quadrants to help you think of, oh yeah, there's 4 quadrants instead of there's 50 or 100 different ways to test. So are there any questions? Anybody got any questions or comments? Or you should be able to unmute or type it as a text chat item. No questions? All right. Oh, there's somebody. All right.
So safe to say, of all the roles within that were contained within the 4 quadrants, would you say that the QA and the QA tester has the most demand over all those, or should realistically the BA or analyst or have as much presence as the QA analyst does?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, every shop's different. I mean, it really boils down to what I just put this together because generally speaking, and this is the literature speaking, not me particularly. The BA generally doesn't get into the heavy technology testing aspect, but the tester tends to be everywhere. So the QA test role tends to touch everything, whereas the BA generally touches, directly the system functional and the acceptance testing. But every shop's different. There's no wrong way to do it. I mean, if you have a BA that is really knowledgeable and they can touch all of it, more power to them. But I always want BAs to think in terms of all of the quadrants as they're writing. That's really kind of what I'm after.
That's fair.
That okay? I'm sorry.
That's fair. Just a quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the presence of the dev and the QA tester and the BA, but we don't get into the UAT side of things, where you'd have to bring in a user. Would you, as a BA, usually try and train the user in this is how you should be going through it, or should you be more relying on this is the process by which the user expects to do it, and just kind of finagle as much as you can?
It depends on what you're testing for, right? So if you just want to see how they clumsily fumble around with the machine, and if it's user friendly, which I don't know that that's a real word, then you really wouldn't train them in advance. If it's something that requires, because there's certain things that when you're testing, the user needs to be knowledgeable. You don't want to just send them out there and go, oh yeah, here's how you produce this, and they have no really idea what they're producing. So again, it goes either way. It just depends on what you're ultimately trying to get at. So that's a great question. Is that a similar method used in Agile? This is Agile. I'm a lean software guy, and I've been doing lean software for over 20 years. So you can call it Agile, you can call it lean. I'm Agile, lean, whatever you want to call it. So anything else? All right. Well, thank you guys for your time and coming on with me. Let's just do this. And we're done. Hopefully we'll be able to come out next month we'll try to put together another one. So if you by the way, if you want this slide deck, well, I'm gonna it's a recording, so I'll get the recording to Cliff, and then if you want the slide deck as a PDF, just send me an email to rfrederickpmp@gmail.com, and I will send you a PDF of the slide deck that you can have. So again, just send me an email and I'll get it back to you. So thank you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.